Hi, welcome to Myers ASMR. Today's story time is about jazz, an introduction and a history. But first, I have to take my vitamins with this chocolate, banana, carob, blueberry, peanut butter smoothie that I made, that I also added some turmeric, black pepper, one date, a little whey powder for sweetness and smoothness, coconut milk, Brazil nuts, almonds. Mmm. Chia seeds, flax seeds, a little bit of oatmeal, cinnamon powder, and oh yes, a teaspoon of soy powder, and a teaspoon of about a third cup of sea moss gel that I prepare and boil on the stove. And it is wonderful. It's not too sweet. I don't like it too sweet. Oh, yes, I did add raw honey because raw honey has anti-inflammatory properties. I used to bartend about, I guess it's been about maybe 7 years ago. And when this particular company would switch out their beers every so often, I would say maybe once or two times a year, they would bring in one or two new beers. And so that means they would have to switch out something else or stop selling something else. So I'd be so happy to take those glasses and mugs, because we weren't using those those particular glasses anymore for that beer. So this is one of the few that I still have. And I love this Pilsner mug. I'm in no way promoting beer. I'm just showing you the mug. Do I think a beer every once in a while is okay? Sure. I just never developed a taste for it. I bartended a couple of years, and I tasted it just so I could let customers know if they were looking for something with certain properties and notes. Okay, this one is closest to an IPA. This is closest to that stout, that bitterness that you're seeking. Now that I could inform people about, but I never really but Blue Moon actually was palatable for me. But if something was sweet, it stood a good chance of me liking it. So I have a case of Angry Orchard in the fridge right now. Stella has a cider that is just wonderful. I don't see it in the bars too much. Lindenmans? It's a Belgian sweet beer. Oh my God, those Boone Creeks and those peach and strawberry beers. Whew. Yeah, I gotta hold myself back. It's been a few years since I've bought one of those. I'm taking my vitamins. That was my vitamin D for sunlight and immunity. I mean, because of the lack of sunlight and the inability to be out in the sun, like we should be, I take the vitamin D for that. So, and I took my collagen peptides for skin and bones and joint health and elasticity. So, and this one is a multivitamin that's by Nature's Way. I think Nature's something. It's called Alive for women. None of this is sponsored. I wish it was, but it's not. This is all my dime, y'all. But when I come across some things that I like and I use, why not talk about it? Right? So this is a typical breakfast for me. I pretty much never do toast. Occasionally I'll do oatmeal. Usually it's on the weekend because I need to be alert and awake on my job, so I really limit the types of foods that will make me sluggish and tired. So at the start of the day, I really need my energy. I really need to be focused and awake because let me tell you, as I'm getting older, it doesn't take much for me to nod out. It's crazy. I can just start nodding in the middle of anything, anywhere. Just sitting for 2 minutes and I'm asleep. So I feel like my energy needs are higher and stronger now than when I was younger. So I really have to be careful with, my breakfast. Now, you do see me eating pancakes and whatnot on camera, but believe me, I'm not eating any of that stuff before I go to my job. That's done after work and on the weekends. So, this shake, this is so good. And ain't a bad thing in it. Well, maybe that whey powder, but that's about it. If I had an avocado, I would have put that in there. That makes the smoothies really smooth and nice and creamy. Then I probably wouldn't have used as much whey powder. Well, let's get into today's story time. I grew up in a jazz household. We weren't musicians, but people thought my dad was a musician because he was so obsessed and so knowledgeable about jazz music. I mean, he listened to more jazz than probably anybody ever. It was a constant in our house, 24/7, just background, and I still don't understand the music, but I would like to. So, let's see where we left off. This chapter is about blues and roots, jazz before 1920. The first jazz legend. Jazz's first legend, cornetist Charles Buddy Bolden and his ragtime band dominated music in New Orleans for the first decade of Storyville's existence. Though his life ended in tragedy, his influence was lasting. A cylinder recording said to be made by Bolden's group around the time of Storyville's inception has never surfaced, so we know Bolden by one surviving photograph and stories of his romantic and business exploits. These stories have proved to be as unsound as the notion that his horn could be heard for several miles. What Bolden, born in 1868, does appear to have possessed was a solid grounding in brass band and church music and an ear for every other variety of sound being played at the end of the 19th century. Bolden's band. The band that Buddy Bolden formed in the 1890s is definitive of what the world would come to know as the traditional New Orleans jazz ensemble. Bolden's lead part was complemented by the more liquid high lines of a clarinet and the plungent lower flourishes of a valve horn or a trombone. The rough polyphony of the band's intersecting lines teased and tugged the borders of the marches and rags in its repertoire. Known as King Buddy at his peak, Bolden possessed a fragile temperament that grew more erratic with his increased consumption of alcohol. An arrest during the 1906 Labor Day parade preceded Bolden's commitment a year later to a mental institution. He remained there undocumented, save as jazz's first tragic figure until his death in 1931. Bolden's influence. Fortunately, Buddy Bolden's message had been heard by a younger generation of New Orleans brassmen, none of whom surpassed the King's reputation for charisma or sheer power, but who did keep their wits about them longer and survived to be documented on record. One was Freddie Kephart, who assumed the leadership of the already successful Olympia Orchestra in 1906 at age 16. He later played in such fabled outfits as the original Creole Band and the Eagle Band, and his sound and phrasing were said to be closest to Bolden's. Kephart introduced muted effects with water glasses and beer bottles in the bell of his cornet, as well as fingering techniques that he concealed from his rivals by draping a handkerchief over his horn. A fear of being plagiarized led Kephart to turn down an opportunity to record shortly before the ODJB was first documented. The recordings Kephart did make in the 1920s showed the effects of his own drinking problem. Joe Oliver, however, inherited Bolden's crown and became a primary early ambassador of New Orleans music. According to legend, he became King Oliver in 1910 at the age of 25 by standing on a Storyville street where Kephart was performing and blowing a blues with a strength and purity that Kephart could not match. Whether the story is true or apocryphal, Oliver soon had Kephart's job at Pete Lala's Cafe, where he led bands or worked in the group of trombonist Edward Kid Ory for several years. Did you know the Oliver Ory ensembles were the ultimate expression of New Orleans ensemble music in its native environment? They included clarinetist Sidney Bechet and Johnny Dodds, and eventually the teenage cornetist Louis Armstrong. Another sippy sip. This is so good. Sometimes I have to remind myself that this is healthy because it tastes like ice cream. And it makes me wonder, if you can make it taste this good, why do they even make ice creams and desserts so unhealthy when you can actually make them tasty and healthy? I guess the natural ingredients cost more, but it's worth it for your health, right? I should have put a little coffee in it. You know, carrot powder is so good. Jelly Roll Morton. In the parlors of such Storyville haunts as Lulu White's and Tom Anderson's Annex. Pianists rivaled bands for prominence. The dominant pianist, historically thanks in part to his own talent for self-promotion, is Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe, better known to the world as Jelly Roll Morton. As adept at hustling pool and fabricating a biography as he was at playing and writing music, Morton made numerous claims that have not survived historical research. His declaration in a 1938 letter to Downbeat that he created jazz in 1902 grows even more fantastic now that scholars have determined that Morton was all of 12 years old at the time. Yet the sense of outrage that prompted Morton to write to the magazine and to dismiss such pretenders to innovation in his eyes as W.C. Handy and the ODJB was rooted in honest achievement. Morton was a master of fusion decades before the term gained musical meaning. He brought together the syncopated motion and contrasting structure of ragtime, the more rolling beat of the piano-less marching bands, and the dipping habanera rhythms of Latin music. Even styles he held in low regard like the blues, which, as a Creole he considered a crude and limited form, became ingredients in the specialty numbers he performed in the brothels while still a teenager. Morton, like Handy, undoubtedly put his name to more than one melody that was in the public domain. But Morton had a genius for shaping and strengthening such raw materials with rhythmic contrast, dramatic breaks, and transitional passages that were later developed from his piano solos into full band arrangements. Did you know Jelly Roll Morton wasn't the first New Orleans musician to take the city's music north? That distinction goes to the Onward Brass Band, which appeared in New York in 1891. The music hits the road. While Morton's New Orleans period, like Oliver's, did not survive on recordings, both men had a major impact outside their native city long before their first visit to a studio. Morton traveled to other southern states before 1910, appeared in New York's Harlem in 1911, where James P. Johnson, soon to be the leading exponent of stride piano, heard him play the blues, and he was working throughout California and Mexico between 1915 and 1923. Unlike other early New Orleans players, Kid Ory eschewed a trip up the Mississippi River in favor of the West Coast. Similarly, African Americans seeking better employment opportunities and escape from the more oppressive forms of segregation streamed out of the South in the early decades of the century, and their music inevitably followed. Freddie Kephart visited both coasts with the touring Original Creole Band before settling in Chicago in 1918, while Kephart's rival Joe Oliver also visited Chicago a year later, the same year in which Kid Ory became a California resident. Well, thanks for listening and watching. Like and subscribe. Catch me in the next video. And may you find lasting happiness. Bye.